Tom, thank you very much for joining us at TvAbraham. It's great to see you again. I last worked with you at the State Department when you were the consular, and I knew you as State Department's premier Latin America expert. But then, of course, you went up to be the Undersecretary of State covering, for political affairs,
Correct.
the senior career official in the State Department covering the whole world. So let's start out with Latin America. And let me ask you, I read the mainstream media that tells me that there's nothing wrong with a Hong Kong company managing the port on both ends of the Panama Canal. Now, what do you think? Is this a problem, or should we agree with the mainstream media that just ignore that, that's not a problem?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Bob. It's a great pleasure to see you. It's a great pleasure to be here on TvAbraham. In many ways, the effort, the work done by the Carter administration and the Panamanians to fashion the agreements that led to the transfer of the Panama Canal from the United States to Panama were one of the signal accomplishments of American diplomacy in the later half of the 20th century, effectively reducing the potential for significant internal turmoil in Panama and threatening the stability and well-being of the canal over time, and also threatening how the United States was seen and understood in Latin America. The Panamanians have shown a remarkable capacity to manage the canal well. But what has captured the attention of the Trump administration and many people here in Washington is not just the presence of container facilities. It's also a change in Panama's diplomatic stance towards China. Historically, Panama recognized Taiwan, as did most of the countries of Central America. But during the first part of the Trump administration, that flipped. And the Panamanians agreed to break relations with Taiwan and establish relationships with the PRC. And what President Trump and his administration are trying to signal is that the United States is the primary strategic partner of Panama and the primary commercial partner of Panama. And that Panama needs to be very careful about providing to the PRC a strategic either competitor or adversary, depending upon your viewpoint, of the United States, providing them any privileged place in the Western Hemisphere. And the Panamanians have adjusted. They've pulled out of the Belt and Road Initiative. They've underscored their commitment to the United States as a primary strategic partner. But there's actually a bigger point that needs to be made here, which is that, as I think many people know, the Panama Canal no longer meets the traffic needs that are coming through. As global trade develops, it's going to become apparent that as important as the Panama Canal is, both practically, strategically, and symbolically, that we need to have a variety of pathways to bring goods either into the United States or into the Caribbean and the Atlantic and to other markets.
In Latin America, 26 years ago, at the end of the 90s, you had democratically elected governments, I think in all of the countries except perhaps Cuba. 25 years later, it's a very mixed picture. And so my first question there would be, what happened in Latin America? And the second question is, of course, Latin America is itself very important, but does it have ramifications in Europe and Asia, even the Middle East?
It's a great question because what's striking about our hemisphere, the Americas, which you remember, they're talking about 35 countries that stretch from Canada to the tip of South America. But all of these countries at the beginning of this century, in 2001, made a commitment to democracy as the only legitimate form of government in the hemisphere, both through the Summit of the Americas process and through the Organization of American States, and issued a political statement, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, that underscored that. And what was remarkable about that process and effort is that this was a region that was defined by poverty, inequality, and exclusion. And yet it had determined that democracy was the best form of government to address the really significant economic and social development challenges of the hemisphere. But like all democracies around the world, they're facing really significant challenges now driven by the expectations that have been created. But at the end of the day, these countries are committing to democratic government not because they want a democratic state, but because they want a democratic society. They want the opportunity, the education, the security, the resources necessary for individuals to have a say in their own destiny, not just in their national destiny.
Right.
And the challenge that we face today is, can democracy in these kinds of countries deliver the goods? And in some countries, it's a resounding yes. But in other parts of the region, you mentioned Venezuela,
Yes.
Cuba, obviously, Nicaragua, the institutions have not delivered. They've collapsed. The institutions of the state have been occupied by political forces that have no intention of ceding power. It creates political dissonance in a hemisphere that has been used to having significant kind of solidarity and engagement through institutions like the Organization of American States.
What should we make of Brazil's efforts through the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, I think it now includes South Africa, maybe others. Is that a serious thing? And what is Brazil's role in that?
It all depends on how the organization functions and how the members relate to each other.
Right.
When the BRICS were just BRIC,
Right.
and then with the addition of South Africa became BRICS.
Right.
For Brazil, it was a remarkable kind of prestige elevator or status elevator in the sense that Brazil, which had understood itself as an aspiring global player,
Right.
suddenly found itself seated with China, Russia, and India. And then adding a large and important African country, South Africa. However, as BRICS evolve, and as both China and Russia look for ways to bring into BRICS countries like Iran and others that are decidedly anti-American or anti-United States, and determined to shape an agenda which is contrarian to U.S. politics and U.S. diplomacy, the Brazilians find themselves in a somewhat uncomfortable place. Brazil's purpose has always been to expand its independence and expand its field of maneuver diplomatically, even while it attempts to underscore the shared values and historic relationship with the United States and the growing importance of its commercial relationship with both historically Russia because of fertilizers and China because of China's purchasing of Brazilian goods.
Let's go a little broader now, and I want to try out an idea on you to get your reaction. I'm trying to make sense of the current foreign policy in the early days of the Trump administration. And I think under President Trump, if you believe in that theory of we help those who help themselves, Taiwan is not really helping itself against a major threat. Ukraine, similarly, now, it's fighting a bitter war, but for some reason, 18 to 25-year-olds are not conscripted into the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, if you're being invaded, why is that?
The case of Ukraine, I think, is a little bit different because of the nature of the war there. And then the early recognition by the Ukrainians that if they were going to defend themselves in the short to medium term, they needed to be careful that they weren't sacrificing an entire generation, especially a younger generation. The understanding was that this war was not going to be a short one, and that at one point it was going to become a grinding war, similar to World War I. And so the question was, okay, how do you preserve your society while you fight this war? And I think the Ukrainians are reaching a point now where they're going to have to make bigger decisions. The Trump administration has articulated most recently that they're understanding American security commitments differently. And that they're viewing the world differently. And that this is going to be very upsetting, if not distressing, for many of our traditional partners.
I don't see the Europeans responding to this with a serious military response yet.
Well, actually the Europeans began thinking this through during the first Trump administration. In fact, it was in the aftermath of Chancellor Merkel's visit to Washington and her conversations with President Trump in the early part of his
that's
first
right.
term.
Were you in the room?
I was in the room. In fact, she said that it was time for the Europeans to thank the Americans for being clear about what the future looked like, and that it was time for the Europeans to take much greater responsibility for their security. But Macron is at it again, holding meetings in Paris with both European Union and non-European Union members in order to think through what's happening and try to develop a coherent and consistent response to the United States. Well, if you look at European history, it's all been about how you manage Russia.
Right.
It's all been about how you keep Russia in a larger kind of condominium. These are diplomatic traditions and tendencies that are hard to jettison.
Right.
And the German approach, for the longest time, was to involve Russia in the economy of Western Europe.
Right.
And the United States had a similar approach in terms of promoting U.S. investment in Russia, and some of it very high-end investment. But all this breaks down with the decision by President Putin to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And so, in many ways, we're still trying to unentangle ourselves from a very long history of trying to manage Russia from the outside.
What's your feeling about the new generation of foreign service officers and maybe the students that are taking your interesting international relations courses at Princeton? How do you see them?
Well, first of all, I'm a huge cheerleader for the U.S. Foreign Service and for my colleagues and friends who remain in the Foreign Service and at the State Department through a period of time that I think is going to be pretty rough.
Okay.
Just because the current administration is quite determined to reduce the size of the federal government. But it's important to understand, you mentioned students in Princeton. What's striking about the students that I teach is that they were all born after 9/11. In other words, for them...
That's history for them, huh?
Well, it's like Pearl Harbor is for us.
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
And they understand the impact of it, the importance of it, but they didn't live through it.
Right.
They're wonderful young men and women. They're very bright. They're very ambitious. They're very determined. And they're not in the least bit intimidated or afraid. But their understanding of American power and American purpose in the world is different. And they're very reluctant to be drawn into the kinds of us against them thinking, which continues to be articulated.
With China, for instance.
Yeah, which continues to be articulated within the national security elites of the United States.
Well, thank you for that anecdote, Tom. That is a great one. And thank you for your service and leadership in the Foreign Service and for this great interview. Thank you.
Thank you. Real pleasure.
Thank you.